Class is now in session. I'm Professor Hockey, and today we're discussing Game 72 of the regular season between the San Jose Sharks and the Vancouver Canucks, in which the Sharks have lost 7-2, and that's probably the most exciting part of this game. The Sharks lose 7-2 in Game 72, a fun coincidence. But the Sharks have played a lot of bad games this season, a lot of embarrassing games, a lot of boring games, and while this game certainly falls into all of those categories, it also falls into another one that we have seen multiple times this season, and that is one of the more depressing games of the year, as it continues to just be more and more difficult to actually watch this San Jose Sharks team. We are 72 games into the regular season. There are only 10 games remaining at this point, and it has been known for, at the very least, for all Sharks fans the last 20 games that this season was completely lost. Most Sharks fans believed just 40 games ago that this season was completely lost, and there are even some Sharks fans who believed from minute one of the regular season that the Sharks would not be able to make the playoffs, and so you're not necessarily watching for any excitement there. You take a look at the lineup, and there really aren't many names that are jumping off the page. There's, Erik Karlsson is interesting to watch to see if he might hit the 100-point mark, which is looking less and less likely as each game goes by, especially since that Timo Meier trade. But there was really only that brief excitement with William Eklund getting called up from the Barracuda for that small stint of games before being sent back down for contract reasons, because especially now, even with the Sharks calling up a few other Barracuda players, we're seeing players like Agazino or Kaut or Jacob Peterson get called up, and I'm not saying I have anything against these three players. They all certainly proven themselves in the minor league and deserving of being called up to the major leagues. Agazino and Kaut showing some solid performances with the Barracuda, Peterson showing solid performance with the Texas Stars, but the fact is I look 3 years in the future at the San Jose Sharks' future plans, and do any of these three players actually factor into that structure? Almost certainly not, and so I'm not necessarily watching for any future gains to see how a player may or may not actually develop. And so you turn on the San Jose Sharks and you think, I'm strapped in for 60 minutes in which the Sharks are almost certainly going to lose and get outplayed. It is a difficult sort of justification for why one might actually want to turn up this game. Even here tonight, the Sharks played against one of the other pretty bad teams around the league, the Vancouver Canucks, and yet they still just get run over 7-2. It's just not really a very interesting experience at this point. Moving on to the actual game, I guess, we take a look at the first period, and generally this first period wasn't terribly played. It was relatively even at 5-on-5 play if we discount the actual goals scored. The Sharks actually even had some really brief, or not even necessarily brief, but some really strong moments. There was a 2 or 2.5 minute shift in which the Sharks cycled a couple of lines even, where they kept it entirely in the Canucks defensive zone. They didn't actually manage to score a goal off of that, but it showed some sort of impressive forechecking and puck movement. But in the end, the Sharks end up, through multiple defensive zone breakdowns, falling behind 3-1 in this first period. You take a look at the Miller goal, and it is Tomas Hertl just passing it straight to him. You take a look at the Joshua goal in the dying seconds of the first period. The Sharks just completely overload one side of the ice, leaving Joshua completely open and able to make his move on James Reimer. And so the Sharks, they're down 3-1 by the end of the first period, and the defense really didn't improve much past those 20 minutes. And the Sharks, who were at least remotely competitive in the first period, just completely fell off. I mentioned earlier the Sharks couldn't even hit the 20-shot mark here tonight, and the very few amount of chances do support the fact that the Sharks just did not look good here tonight. They did not look engaged here tonight, and I already mentioned earlier on that it's very difficult as a San Jose Sharks fan to continue to watch these types of games. I can't even imagine the difficulty as a San Jose Sharks player. Obviously, you're paid huge money to be able to show in and game out, but you're coming up to the last 10 games of the season. You're literally second last in the league. It must be pretty difficult to try and get any sort of motivation in those types of situations, especially when you look at, after the first period, you're already sitting down 2 goals, 3-1 in the hole at that point. And so it is Garland who adds a second period goal to make it 4-1. There was a brief moment in which it looked like maybe there was some sort of chance for something as Agazino added a shorthanded goal, but literally just 15 seconds later, the Canucks get back their 3-goal lead. A minute after that, they go up to a 4-goal lead, and eventually it is a 7-2 victory, and the defensive zone breakdowns did not improve past that first period. You take a look at the Garland goal, he's left all alone. You take a look at the Dries goal at the end. Erik Karlsson's left completely embarrassed on that one, and just generally, like I said, a depressing game, a boring game, a bad one, an embarrassing one, every possible negative adjective that you can give under the sun. This was just not a good game to watch from a Sharks fan perspective. On to the players to talk about, I guess. We did have some lineup changes here. A couple players getting injured, a couple players getting called up, putting back into the lineup. And so we had some line juggling on the top line. We had Barabanov and Couture reuniting, and they would be joined by Andrew Agazino, a pretty surprising addition to the first line. He was called up for last game, and he was inserted on the fourth line, but I guess he did well enough, and I'd say he did okay to get boosted up all the way to the first line. Not as though there's that much competition for this particular roster spot, and I would say Agazino actually did a pretty decent job, was one of the few San Jose Sharks players who actually got like a decent chance in this game. Not only did he manage to score shorthanded, but there was also another opportunity a couple minutes later in the third period where he came very close to actually being able to score. So certainly props to him, the San Jose Barracuda captain who was leading them in points. Obviously, like I mentioned in the previous game, more of an AHL journeyman, and like I mentioned earlier, he does not factor into the San Jose Sharks plans 3 years into the future, but I guess, good for him if he ends up going elsewhere at some point, let's say in this upcoming offseason. And then when it comes to Couture and Barabanov, I thought Couture had an okay game, I guess, in the grand scheme of things compared to his teammates, but nothing amazing. When it comes to the second line, we had Hertl and LeBanc joined by Noah Gregor. Nice to see Noah Gregor get a bit of a promotion here to the second line. I've actually appreciated Gregor's game over these past few. He has kind of been very up and down at times this season. At first, he was barely even managing to get much NHL time, but as of late, especially with the departure of Timo Meier, there are a lot more open spots, and with the departure of Nick Bonino, so it's very difficult to not manage to get a roster spot at this point if you're Noah Gregor, but he certainly has worked his way up into this top six, so it was nice to see him get an opportunity here with Hertl and LeBanc. This line as a whole was half decent. I thought Hertl, at least in the first period, looked rather solid. Yes, there was that terrible giveaway to JT Miller, but he then did at least make it up with a goal of his own and a couple of other solid chances. So there's that. Otherwise, past that first period, like much of the rest of this team, it was kind of just a steep decline from there. When it comes to the third line, we had Sturm Zetterlund being joined by Jacob Peterson, acquired in the Scott Reedy trade at the trade deadline, a sort of minor league player for minor league player swap to try and get those two players rejuvenized, I guess. I don't know how Reedy is currently doing in the Stars organization, but Peterson gets the call up here tonight, does earn an assist. He actually had the secondary assist on the Tomas Hertl goal. Otherwise, he took a penalty and was like half decent, I guess, but nothing really to write home about. When it comes to the fourth line, we had Kaut get demoted. He was obviously in that top six for last game, now dropped down to the fourth line with the bromance of Lindblom and Lorentz. The fourth line was there. There's not much else to say. There was also some line juggling here on the defensive pairings. We had Karlsson being joined by Vlasic, and for those who remember, back at the 18-19 offseason, or I guess I should say the 17-18 offseason prior to the beginning of the 18-19 season, when Karlsson was acquired from the Ottawa Senators, the big hype from a Sharks perspective is that they could play Karlsson and Vlasic together, and that could make up one of the best defensive pairings in the league. This was at a time in which Vlasic, his game had declined slightly at the very least, but he was still sort of resting on those laurels of being a relatively reliable defensive defenseman, and so it was expected that Karlsson Vlasic could make up an unstoppable pairing. That obviously didn't end up happening. Karlsson actually played very well in that first season, at least for good chunks of it prior to his injury. It was just that for whatever reason, when Karlsson and Vlasic were put together, it was like oil and water. They never actually mixed all that well. And so while we have seen them at times over the past few years get put together, it never actually lasts. Here tonight, I don't think they were necessarily all that terrible as a defensive duo. Erik Karlsson had some fantastic moves, and earlier on I mentioned it's difficult for these players to maintain motivation, and I feel as though there's not really much other players who really exemplify this more than Erik Karlsson. I mean, the stark contrast in his play from the first period of this game just to the third period really does show that. You take a look at his effort on the Dries goal that made it 7-2, and you're thinking, like, is this guy even wanting to be here at this point? And then you look at his first period effort where the Sharks, I guess you could say, still had a chance to win this game, and he's setting up great chances, he's making fantastic plays, and so it's just, he's a very emotional player. We have already seen this multiple times, him really letting go of his emotion at times through anger, and it feels as though he's kind of gone through the 5 stages of grief at this point, and he's finally reached that final stage, which is acceptance, and he's at this point where it's just like, hey, we've got 10 games left, let's just get through them, which is obviously not a good sign to have in a hockey player, but here we are, I guess. Then when it comes to the second pairing, we had Shemek returning to the lineup. He would end up getting placed with Knizhov, I guess you could say, on the second pairing, though you might consider this as the third pairing. I think officially it was the third pairing for the San Jose Sharks, but it doesn't really matter. That's sort of picking hairs at this point. I thought this duo, not really all that much to write home about. Knizhov had some good moments, but also had some really bad moments, was on for a couple of these Vancouver Canucks goals, and he's just making poor reads in those situations. Just generally, this was a pretty bad game defensively for a few of these players when it comes to just specific moments, because like I said, those defensive zone breakdowns could really pin on a lot of these defensemen, so a bit of a rough game there. And then when it comes to the goaltender, James Reimer, he lets in 7 goals. That's just a bad game. There's not really else much to say about it. But that will do it for this review. The Sharks will be back in action on Saturday, where they will take on the Calgary Flames for an afternoon game. And we can only hope, even if in a San Jose Sharks loss, that at the very least we could have some sort of amount of entertainment. But actually, before we go, I did forget to mention the standings here. The Canadiens up at 62 points there at the top, 72 games played. It's pretty much guaranteed the Sharks are not going to catch that team, and so we're really only looking at the Ducks and the Blackhawks. They were both losers here tonight, joining the San Jose Sharks, so all 3 of those teams stand pat. But obviously the most interesting part here is with the Blue Jackets in last place, up at 70 games played, still with 2 in hand on the San Jose Sharks, but they beat the Washington Capitals a couple of days ago in overtime, jumping up to 51 points, just 2 behind San Jose. Class dismissed.